Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares on-the-ground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. This episode is edited from a presentation by Dr. Wang Dan, China Director of Eurasia Group, at a European Chamber event Inside China, Is China's Economy Turning the Corner, that took place on 19th June 2025. In the presentation, she focused on answering the question, how resilient is China's economy?
So my great pleasure to share with you on this question, how resilient is China's economy? I've recently just finished a very long research trip, and this is my first presentation. One question I want to answer is how Chinese companies respond to Trump's tariffs and how local governments see the status of the current Chinese economy. Because when we look at the policy response from the central government, they seem to be quite confident. There's definitely a bubbly feeling there. And that's the kind of feeling I also got from talking to centrally owned enterprises and SOEs. Those top leaders in those companies sort of got a feeling that Chinese government got it. They also got all those financial risks in check. So they have been following the strategic plan step by step, and things are going well. That's the general perception I got. Of course, they realize the difficulties facing Chinese economy, especially when it comes to consumption. But at the same time, they would all acknowledge it's temporary, not permanent. Of course, this can be a party line, but I sort of get a feeling that to a certain degree, they genuinely believe this. For my trip, about 1 week in Hong Kong, that's mostly for clients, but also to visit a number of mainland companies that have branches set up in Hong Kong. And the main purpose of those companies is to serve their overseas enterprises. And some of them are fairly new, manufacturing at the range of mid-level or lower level supply chain. So they want to venture out, not just in ASEAN, but also in Latin America and Middle East. The first point I want to say is that China's export sector remain quite strong. Even when we look at before Trump announced Liberation Day tariff, it was still quite strong. So the total trend is the export sector as a whole is upgrading very quickly. But the overseas destination has changed drastically in the past 4 years. The number one market now is ASEAN as a whole. The number two is still US, but this year we expect China's export to the US to decline by about 1/3, and that would make it the fourth largest market after ASEAN, EU, Latin America, and then there's the US. Actually, US and Latin America is about at the same level if we account for the direct trade decline. The export increase in the past few years was not because of transshipment. So transshipment did happen if the companies still want to get into the US market. But by just looking at the macro data and by talking to those companies, they have been trying really hard to divert much of the trade to other markets already since 2018. So the 2020 COVID had given China an extra boost. So their diversion in terms of trading partners has accelerated since then. The US trade is about 20% of China's total international trade, and it's still shrinking. Partly because, of course, there's a transshipment, but also partly because the domestic difficulties the US is facing. One interesting thing I noticed when talking to those exporters in Guangdong and Fujian is that, of course, they talk about the impact from tariffs, but simultaneously they talk about the financial difficulties of their major buyers in the US. For example, say Target or Home Depot. Home Depot is doing relatively well compared to others. Bed and Bath Beyond, those relatively big buyers for their consumer goods, they are having their own separate financial issues. They have inventory problem, inventory management problem. So those Chapter 11 bankruptcies has actually caused more difficulties for Chinese exporters before this year than any other reasons. So transshipment, of course, is an option for many of them, but a lot of the companies I talk to decide not to do that because that is basically a depletion of their wealth accumulated during the years. And when I ask them the question, how they respond to tariffs, by the importance of their answer, basically by the number of answers I got, then the number one response is a trade diversion. The trade diversion has different format. Of course, much of the trade will be diverted to Europe. It's the second best market right after the US. Those consumers have still deep pockets, but their consumption behavior is very different from the US. The US market has the deepest pockets of all. If those exporters could keep their presence in the US, they would not give it up. So even if they are now designing a new strategy European strategy or ASEAN strategy or Middle Eastern country strategy, they're not giving up their US market. It's just they are still in this wait and see mode to see what's going to happen after the 90-day of the truce. And then the number two response, offshoring. So companies are increasingly talking about in expanding their countries of origins. So the number one country of origin, of course, is China. Number two country of origin often is Vietnam, and those two are very familiar with. And then number three, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, you name it. And then more often, I would hear different countries in the Middle East. So the UAE, the Saudi, the Oman, those countries with a relatively stable political scene and sort of a government that still makes sense, they would attract more of attention of those Chinese exporters, because the number one factor they consider when making the offshoring decision is of course cost, but number two is the political stability. They need the country to have political stability. They don't care if it's achieved by the military government or by some dictatorship. They need it to be stable so that they don't have to deal with more risks when they make those costly initial investments. And then many of the companies also talk about direct investment in the US. This is to my surprise, because one would think for many of them it doesn't make sense. But the reasons I have heard from mostly the consumer goods producers, and then in the energy sector, not new energy, but more of a traditional energy sector, they make cells, make energy storage units, make solar panels. They would like to keep their presence in the US. And although it's more costly for them to set up a unit in the US, but even after accounting for that, the profit margin is still much higher than that in China. So if they produce in China and then export in the US, then it's zero profit. But if they invest in the US, normally they will still get, that's the number among the companies I visited, it's usually still between 30 to 60%. It's very profitable. The only problem is that they have to make sure the scale is small. So they cannot make it too big a scale to attract attention. There is not much of a political pushback from the US government, because most of those like consumer goods, industrial inputs producers, or say like dishwasher makers, microwave makers, candle makers, they're not politically sensitive. But the tension with the local union is always there. For those Chinese companies, their big trouble in the US is to find the right engineer to keep up their production lines. They need trained engineers, like with particular skill. And those skills are very abundant in China, but in the US, they basically have to pay a lot more money regarding that issue. So they would want to try to make their production line as automatic, as smart as possible. And that means not employing much of the local labor, and it's not welcomed. And if they make it too big a scale, it could also cause more attention when it comes to like environmental protection, or other times a regulatory framework conflict. So they want to avoid that. But overall, Chinese government is very much friendly or even encouraging when it comes to those companies' decision to invest in the US. One reason they cited is that the Chinese government wants Chinese companies to go global as quickly as possible. So in the future, there should be more of a Chinese company's presence in every field. It's not just those like clothing, toys. It also should be most of the high-tech industry, advanced equipment making. And they should also be making standard. And that can only be achieved if more companies are all over the world, especially in the US. So a higher presence is really a key. And some of the companies are not in a very good cash position. So the past 3 years was basically pretty draining for them, since most of them also have a domestic business segment, and they have been losing money. So the liquidity has slowly dried up for many of those mid-scale, small-scale producers. So a few of them are seeking acquisition. And I talked to a number of like the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers for the auto industry. They usually seek acquisition from Japan, Korea, because that's where their comparative advantage is. And for sure, those companies, those Chinese companies, already made investment in, say, Thailand or Vietnam, but their overseas factory cannot really sustain anymore because of all those difficulties in their domestic factories. So there's a profit problem. There's also a cash problem. So they're seeking some overseas acquisition of their overseas factory. And once that happens, they will also take a small stake in the newly formed JV. And it's another way to survive, and also another way to use Chinese technology. And some other popular response would include like sell domestically, but there is a limit because many of the products are made with American standard or European standard. They don't necessarily sell well domestically. And some products only have a market in the US, say like candles. Chinese people just don't use that many candles like the US, or gardening. So that means a lot of those capacities have to be cut. And we have noticed a number of shutdown already in April following Trump's announcement of the tariffs. And in May, actually, the shutting down of SMEs has accelerated among the industry I have been following. And this means a few things to me in both short term and long term. One thing is, in the long term, probably this will help China to get out of this deflationary cycle. The capacity will be lost as more companies moving their capacity overseas or just simply shut down because it's really hard to manage business with this kind of uncertainty. But simultaneously, it also means there's going to be a gap between the younger entrepreneurs and older entrepreneurs. Right now, the export sector in China is getting pretty old. Those owners are usually in around the age of 50, and not like between 40 something to 70 something. Not everyone has the intention or courage or even ability to venture into new market and start over again. So for them, the natural choice is to find a succession plan, just like China, they need a succession plan. And those companies also need a succession plan. Not very successful, I have to say, because for Fujian entrepreneur community, it's very clear that they're mostly privately owned. They definitely need a second generation to take over the business. I have met two of those second generation, both educated abroad in Australia and in the US. They certainly know a lot about the capital market, but they know almost nothing about how to operate in China. And maybe handing over the business to them is not a bad idea, but you can almost see that over time, the business will go into a different route. And those people may not necessarily stick to the original business plan. They might even seek acquisition, just selling the company to someone else because it's easier. And one other type of response that I didn't write it here, but it's quite interesting to me, is that the factories are getting quite inventive on how they operate. Because before, in the export sector, there's a distribution of profits between factories, middlemen, and end user, the buyer. But now it looks like every factory I visited, they have an e-commerce unit, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So it's a quite interesting thing, because previously it didn't make sense for them to set aside this kind of unit. It's small scale, and those companies thrive over scaling up. And now they could hire more of those low cost, highly educated Chinese labor. So normally with a high school degree or even higher, and with the help of AI, it's not difficult to extend that part of business. And with e-business, it also gives them more of a pricing capacity, because the profit margin of all those factories are usually gross profit margin are usually between 5% to 20%. That's for the factory producing the thing. And for the middleman, usually the profit margin is around 60%. And that's pretty high. But for the buyers, normally say like Walmart, so their profit margin could be like 50%, 60% is also pretty high. But now, once those factories get into the e-business, they could just, drastically take down those retail price. And they're very competitive in e-business. And I have seen this trend of using more of the social media to get into the European market or American market, since the profit margin could be like between 5% to 500%, then it doesn't matter if the tariff is like 54% or 145%. It just doesn't matter. For them, if the factories are getting down into this business, they could make it work and still at a very, very fat margin. But this mostly apply to the consumer goods. For most of the industrial goods, like cells or other auto parts or like biotech related devices, it doesn't work that way. Their profit margin is pretty fixed and it's relatively low, around 35%. So tariffs will have a big hit on those other more of the high-tech industries. And another thing I want to mention is that although we have focused so much on electric machinery, high-tech product, we shouldn't forget that China is still one of the biggest producers of textile, and it's upgrading very quickly. In the past few years, with a lot of relocation to other Asian countries, China's own textile industry is still growing. So the total value is increasing actually fairly fast. Even when you look at subcategories of clothing, shoes, other fabrics. So it is one traditional industry that's undergoing modernization, basically using better materials, new technology to make it more appealing to consumers. And then on low value goods, this is the low cost goods that are subject to the de minimis. So $800 in the US, 150 euro in EU. It's a pretty high amount, and this is severely underreported. So even at the official number, it is a significant driver for the overall export. But from the industry, the number I got is usually around like at least 10 times this much in terms of those small parcel exports. And a lot of them are still targeting the US market, and they can still get away with much of the tariffs because there are various ways of getting around the tariffs. Getting inventive with the HS code is one. So you could try to get yourself into different categories by packaging the things in different ways, or by exporting parts instead of the whole thing, and then assemble in an easy way once they get overseas. And many of the domestic producers still view this as a major channel to get into the developing market. And for Chinese economy, the most important question is whether it's on track as Beijing sees it. We expect the growth to be 4.5% this year, although it's definitely missing the target, but still very high achievement. And the way to achieve it is not by consumption, but by the same old infrastructure building and manufacturing investment. You look at industry data or the headline figures, the trend is very much the same. So the government budget is unaffected by the infrastructure building. So we talk a lot about whether the Chinese government will have a fiscal problem by investing so much in infrastructure or issuing so much government bond. But this part of the bond issuance is not captured by the budget deficit. So it's this kind of special bond issued by the local government, targeting things like dams, grids, data centers, and all those things are still planned on a very big scale. So for example, the dam, the major project is the one in Tibet, approved last December. It is bigger than the Three Gorge Dam and can easily last for over a decade. If you recall, around 1997, Three Gorge Dam was basically the single project that turned around China's business cycle. And this time, this dam alone clearly is not enough because Chinese economy is much bigger than in the 90s, but still is quite important. And then on top of that, there are clean grids, there's a renovation of grids, there are more data centers, especially AI data center in planning. And I'm sure you have heard of all the development in China's chips and Huawei's latest technology of the Cloud Matrix 384. So once those things go just a little bit upscale, right now it's like small, just within a small group of buyers, but over time they would be extended in application. So once that happens, China will need way more AI data centers in construction. And then on city innovation, especially targeting the older houses and older government infrastructure, there's much more to be spent on. One thing that I think people normally ignore is the lifespan of a Chinese building, especially residential building, is around 25 years. So many of those buildings are approaching the end life cycle at this point. So it definitely needs more government money to go behind it, but it's not enough. So that's why we see like the local government is trying to design new scheme to encourage like the homeowners to pay a little bit more, form some sort of capital pool to support this part of the investment. And then for manufacturing, it's very much focused on the higher end, but this part doesn't generate much jobs and it doesn't generate much GDP. It just generates a lot of attention. In the future, maybe 20 years down the road, those things will eventually turn into the high quality productive forces. But right now, the main effect is still a replacement of the current workforce. And there are a lot more talks about low altitude economy and deep sea technology. And for the low altitude economy, it's actually more services than manufacturing. But NDRC still like to characterize this as some sort of a new and sexy new manufacturing sector. One data point I want to cite here is clearly there's a big labor shortage because Chinese universities, the skill mismatch is very severe. And for, say, workers that can operate machine tools, these are the type of high-end blue-collar workers, they need to have at least a college degree or equivalent in order to write simple code to operate those machine tools. But the universities don't produce much of those labor. Every year, there is a gap, about 2/3. So the market requires, say, 1 million of those high-end blue-collar workers, but universities can only produce about 1/3 of them. And for certain professions, for example, like drone pilots, the market gap is more than 1 million. But Chinese universities can only produce about 2 or 3% of this gap every year. And this is a new job started from 3 years ago. So we can totally see that 10 years, 20 years down the road, many of Chinese workers will work for those really high value added services or manufacturing jobs. But right now, the gap is pretty big. And simultaneously, we have a surplus of those people working in finance, in real estate, in education, and they need to be retrained over time to really fit this new structure of the industry. And the last question is consumption. So consumption ultimately will be a main driver for the economy, but at this point, it is still not. When we talk about consumption, 2/3 is household consumption, 1/3 is government consumption, and this is the ratio before 2020. And after 2020, the main driver for the total consumption is actually government, it's not households. So the government consumption would include, buying new computers, installing like new air cons, or like new computers, you name it, chairs, cars, things like that. But for households, because the income prospect or the job market prospect has deteriorated so much in the past 2 years, when you don't have money, you just can't really splurge. The trading program that the government has been focusing so much on is not a big success this year. Last year, it was a big success because that was like the first year really implementing that scheme. So people were really trading in with cars or phones. And this year, there's really not much left. So the government need to figure out a way to give cash to individuals, but the mindset hasn't really transformed.
During the Q&A session, Dr. Wang commented on whether exports will still be a key driver of the Chinese economy.
The export sector has been a key driver in the past 5 years, and I believe it still will be. And for such investment in the manufacturing sector, it's hard to imagine that those capacities would be like willing to exit the market. So getting all those excess capacity, although the Chinese government deny that they have excess capacity, those capacity will go abroad. And in whatever format, maybe some of them would get out in terms of final goods and services, but most of them, I suspect, will be in terms of the factor of production. So in terms of like sending capital directly, sending out labor directly. Because the thing is, if you cannot export labor-intensive products, you export labor. Yeah. If you can't export capital-intensive product, you export capital. That's just the natural way of those economic spillover. And it means for especially Europe, it's a huge pressure from those competitions from China. And it also means the overall global market would getting a lot cheaper over time.
On the topic of China's exports, she continued to answer a follow-up question on how long other countries will accept this level of Chinese imports.
So clearly, Vietnam is very crowded. So really not much room there. And what I can see is Vietnam want to mirror itself into more like a Korean or Japanese style. They don't want to become just a China now. They don't want to just be a manufacturing center. They want to upgrade. So for there, I think the market is very much saturated. But for other parts of ASEAN, it just seems it's only getting started, not Singapore. Singapore is a very different market. But for Malaysia, Indonesia, Chinese companies are only starting to recruit locally and train locally, started their investment in certain industries, especially auto. And in auto, I noticed the plan is usually like 10 years. That is their estimate of when they could first make a profit, accounting for all those initial investments. And also, those business people often talk about demand. So as long as there is real demand, things will be produced somewhere. So the pushback from some ASEAN countries might be strong enough to stall some of the productions in those areas, but in other places, the production will start. And then there's a wave in political cycles in different regions. And right now, say, Middle Eastern countries are quite welcoming, so there's more investment over there. But maybe at some point, it gets really tight. But those companies have already de-risked from a lot of the markets. They have diversified their investment in so many different places. And I actually can see it's more like a here and there rotating scheme. It's not like a fixating on one market. I think ASEAN will last a very long time. At least for the next 10 years, it's going to be a base for those Chinese companies. One other indicator I noticed, the investment Chinese companies have made in those places in terms of like the machinery they get, is the top-notch machinery, even better than their domestic companies, domestic factories. That means these are strategic investments. These are not for temporary.
Dr. Wang responded to 2 questions regarding the overview of structural reforms in various aspects and domestic social challenges and trends.
If we're talking about structural reform in industries, it's not only happening, it's ahead of schedule, and it surprised everybody. So the Chinese government is the only one in the world that's really embraced this automatic transformation, the AI replacement. There's no other government, not even Singapore, that's willing to take this kind of risk. Just pushing this through the governance system, through the industrial process, in the households, basically with a DeepSeek success story, it's even faster deployment than before. So that part of structural reform is so clear, and it has caused a lot of the structural unemployment. And it's going to be a long-term problem for the government and society to resolve, but they're determined to do that. So this hard structural reform is very real and very fast. Pension reform, as far as I can see it, is improving, maybe too much. Like for my parents, they don't deserve that high pension. Every year 10% increase. They didn't do much. They didn't contribute to the pool even. But the overall picture for whoever's working right now is pretty harsh. Regarding the healthcare and aging, these are very much the long-term challenges, and it's basically a double-edged sword because China's job market is really weak. And it's getting weaker. So it doesn't mean like unemployment that we observe in urban China is increasing. Actually, it has been decreasing. Like people return to their hometown, doing some partial, like part-time job instead of long-term jobs. But the overall job quality has deteriorated. But if without aging, then the job market difficulty will be even more severe. Since last year, about 5 more million people would enter retirement scheme. So by taking out pensions. So of course, every year more people exiting the job market, but not everyone's getting pension. I'm only talking about additional people getting pension. So those people usually are employed in like government position, SOEs or large POEs. So when they exit, new positions are available in those companies. And then for those fresh graduates, of course, they're not getting those jobs directly, but trickle down effect will be, there will be some trickle down effect for those people. So people often see this demographic structure in China as a minus. I totally see it as a plus. For young people, over time, they will have more opportunities. And then for the healthcare system, that's one of the success story that Chinese government often cite. To a certain degree, I agree, because this centrally coordinated healthcare payment system work kind of well. Because before you could only go back to your hometown and join this local access to hospitals and healthcare, but now you could do it in a different city. And that has helped migrant workers especially. And for rural residents, the level of money that they can get reimbursed is also much higher than before. For certain type of big disease like diabetes or heart disease, the treatment is quite advanced and quite expensive, but for them, they can get most of those expenses covered if it's those diseases. But if you are like unfortunately getting something else, then you're not getting anything in reimbursement. But overall, I think for the social safety net, Chinese government has been focusing on providing a floor. So for migrant workers especially, the government is well aware that providing jobs for those people in today's China is very difficult, but they can provide a better safety net. And that's exactly what they have been doing. Like since 3 years ago, minimum wage of all provinces started to increase. It's by batches. They don't increase minimum wage simultaneously, but by batches until this year, every province has a higher minimum wage than 3 years ago. And unemployment insurance, now much bigger coverage than before. One hurdle previously was that if you want to get unemployment insurance, your work unit has to write you a letter to prove that they fired you. But normally a company doesn't want to write such a letter since usually there's not a formal contract or they don't want to be liable for anything else. So people don't rely on unemployment insurance. But this year it's the historical high of the number of people getting unemployment insurance because they no longer need a letter. So it's minimal money, but it's something. And then there's additional pension scheme coverage for migrant workers. It's also very low, but wider coverage. So my point is all those social services are improving, not as fast as people had hoped for, and not as even because it's heavily skewed to urban residents and rural, but overall picture, it is improving. The job market situation, though, is not improving, it's deteriorating.
She also commented on European companies' profitability and whether they should continue to stay in the competitive Chinese market.
I visited a Dutch company, a German company, and a Taiwanese company, and they were doing great because they don't target the US market. And actually, since Trump imposed that tariff, their position is strengthened because their competitors are squeezed out, and especially their American competitors are out. So now they're occupying even bigger market share. So I'm like, this is time to stay here and expand, for European companies. And a lot of the services provided by Europeans are gaining more ground in China because people don't want to choose American services. So if I would say, if you're not American, to totally stay and wait this thing out. The business cycle is always there. And with fewer people playing the ground, then it means if you want to get ahead, that's technology and the type of consumers you can reach. For European companies, the reputation has been stellar among Chinese consumers, and standard is high. For certain products, they have lost their competitive edge. That only means they should double down on research and development. But if anyone really want to retreat from China, the only reason I can think of is really they can't compete in any front with the Chinese competitors, and that's the time to leave. But I haven't really seen any companies, European companies, that has lost to that level.
The European Chamber will host its annual conference on 10th December. Dr. Wang will join a panel discussion on supply chains. You can find the event link in the show notes. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend it to your colleagues and friends, and share it on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find contact details in the show notes. This is Gao Rui from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.